Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining tonight's presentation, Breaking Down Irish Brick Walls, Successful Case Studies in Identifying Place of Origin. I do want to say, even though this is an Irish focus, that many of the strategies that I'm sharing with you today will actually help you in finding place of origin for other ethnicities as well. So just keep that in mind if you have other countries that you want to go back to. Many times these strategies can help you for that as well. The examples that I'll be providing today, though, do revolve around Ireland specifically. There will be 3 case studies in total that I'll be sharing with you. So I want to start off with a quote from John Grenham, the author of Tracing Your Irish Ancestors. And he said, in general, the most useful single piece of information is the locality of origin of the family. For the descendants of Irish immigrants, the locality is often one of the most difficult things to discover. And if you're anything like me, your US records probably only list Ireland in many of the various records that are out there, whether it's a naturalization record or a census or a vital record. You can see that I've circled where it'll just make a reference to Ireland. And so that leaves us with more questions of where in Ireland, because I want to continue my research there. And without knowing a county at least, and ideally a townland, it gets very difficult. So if you look on the death certificate I have on the right, there's Patrick Herbert from Ireland circled, but underneath him is Bridget Kennedy from County Tyrone. So at least I have a little bit of information to start researching Bridget, even though that's an extremely common name and it would probably be challenging. So that one would need a little bit more work anyway, but at least I have a direction with 32 counties in all of Ireland, 26 in the Republic and 6 in Northern Ireland. You really need to get that information. There's so many people with similar names, and having that general location is going to be critical. So there are some common strategies I'd like to share. So first, I would like you to start with your family records, your family stories, and prior research conducted. You never know where there's a clue that's really going to be helpful. And I find, particularly with Irish research, that those family stories can be extremely helpful. And also, sometimes it really helps to look back at the records that you have that might be tucked away in file folders or under the bed boxes or wherever you happen to keep your records. And you want to take a look at those because you just never know when there's an important clue in them. And I always recommend looking at your prior research because you're probably a better genealogist now than you were a couple of years ago. And you're going to look at things with a more critical eye, and you've probably learned a lot more since then. And so when you look at something that you've looked at in the past, sometimes there's something that you didn't notice before or that relates to a new clue that you have found. And suddenly it has new meaning. So I always encourage you to refresh yourself and look back at what you already know. And then I recommend that you gather all US records for the research subject that you're focusing on, as well as their family members. So you want to get all the records for the children and the spouse and the siblings, because that can be very telling information. You just never know where they'll be in a clue, particularly about place of origin. So that's really an effort to get reasonably exhaustive research, which is something that we strive for. Sometimes it's difficult, but I really recommend that you try to get as many records as possible for all those people that are closely associated with your research subject. I also recommend that you dissect every record and literally pull every piece of information out of there, because you just never know when a small clue in one record connects to a clue in another record. Kind of like breadcrumbs, they all, sort of connect one to the next. But I have found that something like an address or just a certain surname suddenly opens up some new information for me. So I really recommend that you pull out every piece of information and type it out or write it down, however you happen to do your research. I also recommend using tools like timelines and tables to analyze your findings. I'm a big fan of doing timelines because you'll see where your holes are. You'll see where there's a gap. that there's a point in time where you know nothing about this person and you need to find some records to kind of fill in that hole. Tables actually allow you to package a lot of information and start to see patterns that you may not have seen otherwise. And I often like to combine the two and put timeline, so a chronological format, but within a table. And I'll show you some examples throughout my presentation of how tables can be really effective. And lastly, and this is probably one of the most important things, particularly with Irish research, is researching the fan club. And the fan club stands for friends and family, associates, and neighbors. It's also known as cluster research, but this was a term that was coined by Elizabeth Shown Mills, the very prominent genealogist in our field and the author of Evidence Explained. And basically, she wants you to research the people that surround your research subject. So they might be some people that traveled with them on their ship to America. They might be the witnesses on a marriage record. They might be the sponsors on their children's baptismal record. It could be next door neighbors. It could be people that lived in their building, if you're talking about a city. Or it could be coworkers. Maybe there's somebody that's mentioned in a newspaper article, and that's somebody you want to just kind of jot down and make sure that that you're aware of these people. And I kind of keep a list of these people because you just never know when their names may come up in another place. So the first case study that I'm going to share with you is on John C. Thompson, who is the great-grandfather of Donald Thompson of Waterbury, Connecticut. And this happens to be a client project of mine where I got permission to share because it was an excellent example of finding place of origin. So my client's objective was to research the paternal Thompson line back to Ireland. And he specifically wanted me to research his immigrant ancestor, John C. Thompson, who arrived from Ireland about 1870. And he had married either Mary Ellen or Mary Ann Thompson. And yes, he married somebody with the same surname. So, of course, that adds another layer of complexity to this research project because I had to unpack which Thompsons were on the maternal versus paternal side. And my goal was to verify any information that he provided to me and then conduct this research to identify place of origin to ultimately take the family back to Irish records. So he did give me some starting point information. So as I mentioned, you want to start with family records and stories. And he gave me what I consider to be a blueprint. It was a family diagram that you can see on the left. And it was great in the sense that it had the names and dates and locations for each of the folks that would, all the different grandparents, right? But there was no documentation. There was literally nothing to support anything that he had provided to me. And the only other piece of information was that he had done a consultation back in 2016 with the Family Search Center, and they gave him some good recommendations, but there was really very little information that was actually provided to me. So first, I needed to look at those relationships and verify the genealogical links. So I started out with my client, Donald J. Thompson Jr., who was born in Waterbury, Connecticut. And his father was Donald J. Thompson Sr., whose father was John J. Thompson, whose father was John C. Thompson. So you can see how this would get confusing. Those middle initials are differing for the Johns is helpful, but you can see with the repetition of names, it gets a little tricky, and you have to be really organized to make sure you don't get mixed up. And then that then went to Michael Thompson, who is the second great-grandfather. And thankfully, I was able to find documentation to support all of these relationships. So I felt good moving forward and making sure I was definitely with the right Thompsons. But I needed to find place of origin. And so my next step was to gather all those US records for John C. Thompson and his known family members. And so that's going to include all types of records, obviously vital records, birth, marriage, and death, census records, especially starting in 1870, because that's when he apparently arrived, city directories, military records, newspapers, and honestly, any record I could find. because I really wanted to capture as much as I can, and you just never know where that clue is going to be. So I did ask my client, he happened to reside in Waterbury, so I asked him if he could order the death certificate for John C. Thompson. And that was extremely helpful. He sent me a picture of it, and it indicated that John had died in 1922 in Waterbury, and that he was working at that point as a watchman, which is like a security guard. It said he was born in 1852 in Ireland, and most helpful was that it gave the name of his parents as Michael Thompson and Bridget Givney. And his son, John J. Thompson, had served as the informant, so I'm hoping the information is accurate because it would have been told through family stories and oral tradition. So hopefully all of this information is accurate. I then found the marriage record, and it turned out to be Mary Ann Thompson, not Mary Ellen. And their marriage took place in 1875 in Waterbury. So John was 23, and that supports that 1852 birth year. And his wife was a few years younger. And place of origin for John was listed as Ireland. So I kind of strike out there, but I'm going to keep going. I then decided to look at city directories, and thankfully Waterbury had quite a number of city directories on Ancestry in their U.S. city directory collection. And so starting as early as 1875, I was able to track him. And as you can see here, it goes through 1875 through 1890, and he consistently lived at 6 Pleasant Street in Waterbury. And some of his occupations differed a little bit, and sometimes his middle initial was used, sometimes it wasn't, but the address linked everybody. And the shading for 1880 is indicating also that that was a census. So I had the city directories plus the census overlaid. I continued on, and I tracked him through 1906. And I noticed there was a little bit of an anomaly. In 1891, there was this John C. Thompson, and he was listed as the superintendent here in Waterbury, but his address wasn't listed as far as a home address. And there was a gap. 1892, there was no listing at all. And then starting in 1893, he was at 16 Pleasant Street. And so he was there for quite a while, and then later on, he moved to East Main Street. So I don't know if that 1891 person is my person, but there was nobody else that fit in the city directory listings, and he did share the same middle initial, so I kind of filed that away. And then I continued, and John was living with his son at different points, and he moved quite a bit, a couple of years at each address. Ultimately, his city directory listings ended in 1921, and that was because he died in 1922. But you can see his occupation was as a watchman, which was consistent with his death certificate. So this is amazing that I was able to track his occupation and address from 1875 through 1921. I also found the obituary for his wife, Mary, and that confirmed that, this was the right couple. It connected them to the 16 Pleasant Street address. And it would explain why he started moving, because in about 1904, he started moving to all those different addresses, sometimes with his son. It makes sense. His wife had died in 1903, so it kind of changed the family dynamic, and he wound up moving out of that family home. Then I found the connector document, which was this newspaper article that said that John C. Thompson of 6 Pleasant Street in Waterbury was appointed to the position of superintendent of the almshouse. So now I know that was absolutely the right person in that 1891 city directory. And it said that he held the role for 2 years, which would then account for that 1892 listing, which should have been listed, but it wasn't. So that year, that gap year. But this aligns with those city directories, and I'm feeling really good knowing that I've tracked this man for all those years. And this is important because newspapers wound up being such a critical resource for me on this project. It revealed additional family members, and his position as the superintendent of the almshouse provided a connection to additional Thompson men in the Waterbury area. So I found a sibling named Bernard. He had died in 1890. And most importantly, it said that he was the brother of Reverend James J. Thompson of Taftville, which is Florida, as well as Patrick, Owen, and John C. Thompson of Waterbury. I did my due diligence as well, and I tracked Bernard through all the city directories, and I was able to even find that one in 1876 where he was actually living and working for the same employer as John C. Thompson. So that further validates those family connections. I then found the following year that another sibling, Owen, had died, and it listed him as well as the sibling of Reverend James Thompson, of Superintendent John Thompson of the almshouse, and contractor Patrick Thompson. And again, all the city directories for Owen validated his many different occupations that he held over the years, which were named in his obituary. But this is where I hit what I call the mother lode. This was an article about the death of Reverend James Thompson. And because he was a reverend, he was a prominent person in the community. And although he had died in Tampa, Florida, he had spent time in Waterbury and had a lot of family in Waterbury. And so he got quite a write-up in the Waterbury Democrat, the local newspaper. And the most important piece of information right in that second paragraph was that he was born in County Cavan, Ireland. And it went on to give all the details of his life. It talked about how he and his brother Bernard came to Waterbury in 1872 at the request of family. It talked about how he and his brother Owen went back to Ireland because the father was dying and he was going to give the last rites. It talked about how his sister Elizabeth accompanied him to Florida at the advice of doctors, and she stayed with him until he passed away. And then it named a whole bunch of other family members. His brothers Patrick and John C. Thompson, two sisters, Mrs. Patrick Ryan and Mrs. Kehoe. And then it talked about how his mother and two brothers, Michael and William, as well as a sister named Anne, were still living in Ireland. So this was a treasure trove of information. I couldn't have asked for anything better to give me a starting point to do more research and validate that this information is correct. But basically, based on all the records that I found thus far, I discovered that there were 11 Thompson children. They either lived in Waterbury, with the exception of the Reverend who had moved to Florida, or they were in Ireland. And I was able to get the identity of the two sisters that were listed with their married names, and their names were Mary and Bridget. So 8 of those siblings were found in those Waterbury records. And the names of John's, or their parents with John, death record indicated that it was Michael Thompson and Bridget Givney, but only the obituary for James Joseph Thompson provided that county of origin. So look at, I did a tremendous amount of research, and eventually I got that one clue that helped me move forward in my research. So let's talk about County Cavan. It's located in Ulster Province. It's one of 3 counties that are more in Northern Ireland, but it's not part of Northern Ireland, still part of the Republic. Now, I got another clue in the newspaper in 1907. There was a mention of the death of Bridget Thompson, the mother of Patrick, and they were doing like a 1-month remembrance mass for her because she died in Ireland, and she was named as the mother of contractor Patrick Thompson, and I knew he was referred to as a contractor in other records, so this really piqued my interest. I then went to Irish genealogy.ie, which has a lot of the civil records and the vital records, and it's a free resource, just so you know. And I was able to get her civil death record, and it indicated that she had died 1 month before, August 6, 1907, in Lisnadara, County Cavan. So now I have a townland. So that's an even more important clue because it's much more specific. It said that she was the widow of a farmer and that her son William was present at her death. And of course, William was named in the Reverend's obituary. I also then looked for her husband Michael's civil death record on irishgenealogy.ie, and he had died much earlier in 1882, but he was also listed in Lisnadara, And he was indeed a farmer. And in that case, his daughter-in-law, Catherine, had served as the person that registered his death. So Liz Nadara, I went to a site called townlands.ie, and you can put in the name of a townland, and there are over 60,000 townlands in Ireland. So you can put that in there, and what it does is it gives you a lot of the other jurisdictional information that can prove helpful when you're looking for other records. And what was most important is it said that it was part of the civil parish of Drumlaman South, and the other name for that parish is Ballymacue. So that was important information for me to be mindful of. So I continued to search then for baptismal records, and I went to Ancestry. They have their collection. I can also go to Roots Ireland, which is a subscription-based site as well. But in this case, I found the baptism record for John Thompson, saying that he was baptized on December 20th of 1849, and that his parents were Michael Thompson and Bridget Gibney. So slight variation from what the death certificate said, which was Givney, but that sounds like just a phonetic situation, and that they were both from Liz Nadara. So I do want to point out that all U.S. records had indicated that John Thompson was born about 1852, but here we have a baptism record for 1849, and that's very common with Irish research. They really didn't know their birth dates exactly, so you'll find that you're going to need a little bit of a margin up and down from the year that you think it is, because birth dates just did not hold the same importance that it does today as a form of identity, and you'll find they vary quite a bit in records. So just be mindful of a range and be open to when you look for records. So this is a perfect example, basically 2 to 3 years before, since it was late December. But I know this is my person. It's in Liz Nadara, and he has the right parents. I then proceeded to look for the baptismal records for his siblings. And here's my timeline and table, how I can show you. It's in chronological order, and it lists all of the baptismal record and the key information. So in this case, I actually found 12 Thompson children. The 11 that I had found in U.S. records identified are accounted for. There was one other person named William Thompson. He was baptized in 1851. I have him in italics, kind of in the middle of the chart. I believe that he was the first William Thompson, and I believe he died after Bernard was born, and they named their next child William. I was not able to find a death certificate despite looking, but that was a fairly common practice where if somebody died, they would reuse the name. So, so while there were 12 children born that I'm aware of in my research to Michael Thompson and Bridget Gibney, which you can see consistently, they're listed as the parents. 11 survived, and I was able to account for them, obviously, in all the different records. So I have the baptismal records here, and I also have Elizabeth, or Eliza as she was listed, and Anne. I have their civil birth records because that started in 1864, and so I was able to get that information. So this was a really amazing chart. And I also have, as an aside, the baptismal sponsors, and that's part of their fan club. And so mixed in there, you'll see some Gibney names. I see a John Gibney. I see also Thompson names, a Lawrence Thompson. I see a Margaret Gibney, Owen Thompson. This is going to be probably siblings or cousins of the parents. And so that will help me as I want to go further up the family tree to start identifying other family members. So looking at that baptismal sponsor section is really important. So the strategies I used in this first case study was starting with those family records, family stories, and prior research. I gathered all of those U.S. records, with newspapers being extremely instrumental, as well as city directories. I dissected each record. I pulled out everything I could. And those tools, like the timeline and table approach, especially for what I did for the city directories, as well as for the baptismal records, that helped me to analyze the findings and really, make sure that I am seeing everything and being able to make correlations. and look at that fan club. In this case, it was the brothers, it was those other family members that became part of the fan club that enabled me to be able to provide this information to my client. So he's very excited. And now we not only have a county, but we have an actual townland. And now further information can be conducted. And perhaps he'll want to do a heritage travel and go there one day to see the grounds that his ancestors had walked. So that's my first case study. And as I mentioned, that was for a client. But the next two that I'm going to share with you are actually personal case studies because I have Irish ancestry on my mother's side of the family, and I did not know where anybody was from in Ireland. So I had to use my own strategies and skills that I use for clients on my own family. And I'm very excited to share that I was finally able to discover place of origin. So I'm going to cover two case studies, but I used different strategies for each that I wanted to share with you because it might help you in your own research. So the second case study is about John Joseph Cahill, my maternal great-grandfather. And so, as I talked about, you're going to start with family records or stories. I started with a family story. The story that we heard was that John Joseph Cahill had worked for the railroad in Brooklyn. And one day his daughter, Anna, had walked to the station to deliver a meal for him. And when she got there, she learned that there had been an accident and she never saw her father again. That's all we knew. We didn't know what year. We didn't know why. Did something happen specifically with his role in the railroad? We had no clues whatsoever. It was just a family story that, kind of got passed down. So without any details, I kind of needed to piece together what I knew. And I knew from my mom that her grandfather had a wife named Anna and two children. He had a daughter named Anna who was born in 1894, and he had a son. They had a son named Francis born in 1899, and Francis is my grandfather. And so Anna and Francis were both born in New York. So I had to think about this, say, hypothetically, if Anna was delivering a meal, she was walking by herself to the train station. I know things were a little more relaxed back then, but I was thinking, like, how old was she that she was going on her own to go to this train station? So knowing that she was born in 1894, I kind of used that as my starting point, and I looked at censuses. And so there were several census records that I decided to, look into. First was the 1900 federal census, and that listed John Cahill with his wife Annie, so just a variation on Anna, and they had three children, Annie, Jack, and Francis. And I never heard about Jack. Nobody heard about Jack. So this was a surprise person in the mix. But the birth years for Annie and Francis matched what we knew. So I knew I was with the right family. They were living in Brooklyn, and John's occupation was as a locomotive engineer, so very much in keeping with working for the railroad. When I looked at the 1905 New York State Census, I found Anna Cahill listed as head of household and with two children, Anna and Francis. So where is John, the father, and where is Jack, the son? And then in 1910, she was listed as a widow with the same children, Anna and Francis. So now I knew that they had, at least the husband had died. So between 1900 and 1905, something had happened. I turned to the newspapers. And once I had that range, I was able to get a front page story from the New York Times from November 20th of 1903. And it talked about a train wreck that killed both the conductor and the motorman. And my great-grandfather was the motorman. And so they both happen to have the same last name, Cahill, but they were not related. So it was Patrick Cahill and John Cahill, my great-grandfather. Honestly, I probably found about 25 articles in New York area newspapers, and I was able to piece together everything that had happened, and I got a lot of fantastic clues. And that was amazing just from a personal standpoint to really get a better sense of what happened and what kind of person my great-grandfather was, because there was a lot of character testimony in there. But what I really needed to do in this case was look for records, and I was able to then get his death certificate because he, he had died the day before, November 19th. So I was able to get this through the New York City Municipal Archives. And there were some really good clues in here. It said that he was 38 at the time of his death. So that would suggest that he was born about 1865. It just said he was born in Ireland, so I didn't have a county to work with, and that he had been in New York City and the United States for 20 years. So that would suggest he arrived about 1883. Most important was that his father was named Thomas Cahill, born in Ireland, and unfortunately his mother was unknown, but they knew that she was also born in Ireland. I did not have a name of an informant to assess the credibility of this information, but I suspect that it was my great-grandmother Anna, because the back of this certificate had her working with the undertaker. And their usual residence at the time was on 50th Street in Brooklyn. As an aside, it says that he died of shock and burns to his body and head because it was a very severe and traumatic event. So the next step was that I was going to gather all U.S. records for John Cahill and his known family members. And through additional research, I discovered that they actually had 4 children together. My family has only known about 2 children. So it was a big surprise when I shared with my mother and her siblings that there were actually 4 children. And two were born one was born 1897, the other 1895. But obviously they had passed away and nobody knew anything about them. So my intention then was to find every record I could, and for those young sons to also get their baptismal records as well as their death records. So the first child, Anna, I was able to get her 1894 birth certificate, named her parents correctly, and based on John's age, that would actually suggest he was born about 1860. And so this speaks to that range that we very often see, as I mentioned earlier, with Irish records, that you sort of have to have this margin. And so right now, I'm now dealing between 1860 and 1865 birth for him. Says that he was born in Ireland, so no county or townland listed. I looked for the civil record for John, who was also known as Jack, and unfortunately, there was no record. And not everybody registered the births, even consistently within their children. And sometimes I've seen that in families, and it happened in my own, where some kids were registered and others weren't. So that's where I often turn to baptismal records. And so in this case, I was able to get the baptismal record that named his parents and verified his birth date. And of course, it gave sponsors, so that becomes part of that fan club. I did find his death certificate, though, and it turns out that he died at age 6. And they do list father's birthplace and mother's birthplace, but unfortunately, it just said Ireland. Third child, Thomas, I was able to get his civil birth record, and this one said that John Cahill was 32 years old, born in Ireland, so no details there, but this further validated that 1865 birth year. And what was interesting, it said that John, the father's occupation, was a fireman, and very possible that a fireman would be working for the railroad. They're working with coal, and fires were very possible. So that, I suspected, was another role that he had with the railroad. And then I found Thomas's death certificate. He died very young at only 10 months. And again, John's birthplace was just listed as Ireland. And lastly, my grandfather, Francis, last child, no civil birth record. I don't know why, but they did have the baptismal record, so that verified his birth date, and I have the sponsor name, but unfortunately no information about the birth. But pretty much I'm striking out here. I'm not getting any information about John Joseph Cahill's place of origin other than Ireland. So then I look back at census records, and again, I want to pull everything out of this that I can. And so the family was living on 50th Street. And it gave, the 1900 census is one of my favorites because it gives so much information. And one of the best things is it gives the month and year that they're born. So this indicated that John Cahill was born May of 1865. So that 1865 birth year keeps coming up. It suggests that he immigrated in 1881, that he had naturalized, that he was a locomotive engineer, so consistent, but he had been married for 6 years. So that suggests that they married about 1894. And then it lists more information about his wife and children. Now, in my family records, I had this record for the marriage of John Cahill and Anna D. Hatch. And this was something that I inherited from my uncle, who was our resident family historian. And he was very into it. He actually traveled to Ireland and he was doing a lot of New York research. And so this was in the files that I inherited after he passed away. And what I knew from family stories was that his John's wife Anna was previously married to a man named Milo Hatch. So of course, with her second marriage to John Cahill, her surname was actually Hatch, and I suspect that the D stood for her maiden name Daly. And so they married on January 1st of 1894. And this was actually a record that was created in 1930. This particular church no longer exists, but I think it's really neat that I have this document that's within my family files. So that verifies that 1894 marriage year that the census was suggesting. I then looked at the 1892 New York State Census and I found John Cahill. I think this is my guy. This one shows that he's a fireman, and it says that he was 25 years old. So that suggests maybe he was born about 1867. So now my range is even bigger, right? As early as 1860 and now 1867. But it matches that birth certificate that his son Thomas, where it named him as a fireman. So that's an important clue that helped me find this record. And the fact that he's actually living nearby all these other people that have occupations that are associated with the railroad industry. You'll see there's an engineer and a car cleaner, a coupler, a coal heaver. So I suspect that this was my great-grandfather who was basically living with other guys before he married my great-grandmother. And then, let me just close this. So I started to then look at immigration records, but John Cahill is such a common name. And I had this range of potential birth years, and I was trying to find any John Cahills that came over from Ireland, but this didn't really help me. You know, I looked at all these, but they only name Ireland. They were so early on, they didn't give any information. So it was really hard to know if this was even my John Cahill, but they just were too vague. And then I decided to search Irish civil birth records. And I mentioned earlier that those started in 1864. And most of the records in the US suggested that he was born about 1865. So I thought it was very possible that he would be in these civil birth records. So I looked for candidates for John Cahill, born in Ireland between 1864 and 1870 on that site, irishgenealogy.ie. And it came up with 131 possible John Cahills. So I did look at them because that's what I do. I do very exhaustive research. And I looked for anybody that had a father named Thomas. That's the only clue I had to work with. Well, the only thing with Irish genealogy is that when you get your findings list, you have to manually click on each individual PDF. So it can get a little tedious, but I did that. And I did find a few candidates that had a father named Thomas. One from born in 1865 from County Westmeath, and one born in 1865 from County Cavan. But again, I have no idea if this is my John Cahill. There's no way for me to tie them. There's not enough information. So in a case like this, I usually capture that information in my research log and I kind of file it away because you just never know if there's another record that might tie to one of these people. I then decided to search Irish baptismal records. And so I went over to Roots Ireland, which, as I mentioned, is a subscription site, but it's a fantastic site to help search. And I was able to put in John Cahill with a father named Thomas in all of Ireland that was born between 1860 and 1870. I decided just to kind of broaden that range. And that yielded 31 possible candidates. But again, there was no way for me to know which family was the right family. John Cahill is just such a very ubiquitous name, and the information is just too vague. So at this point, I thought it's time to explore DNA. I've kind of exhausted as much as I could do with documentary records. And I did as much as I could do. And so I thought I have to use another tool in the toolbox. And so I had tested personally on Ancestry DNA and 23andMe. And I had also uploaded my results to MyHeritage and Family Tree DNA because that's something that they do allow usually for free. I can put the raw results up there, and that will help me to see if there's any more hits. I also had my mom tested because she's the one that has the Irish heritage and she's one generation closer. So theoretically, she should have more matches than I would, people that'll come up that I did not connect to. And so that might open up some new clues. And I will tell you that over the years, I had reached out to a number of DNA matches. And if you've worked with DNA, you know it's a little bit of hit or miss. You know that sometimes it takes people a long time to respond to you, and sometimes they never respond. So it was a little frustrating, and I had to really pack my patience because it took quite a while to get some responses. But those that did respond were very fruitful for me. And I had reached out to a number of those that had the Cahill surname because I figured, okay, I know they're definitely from that particular line. But unfortunately, some of them never responded to me. I want to say as an aside, when I looked at my ancestry for a composition from 23andMe, they provide a list of regions that other people who are DNA match have reported that they have ancestors. So this is anecdotal at best, but it's kind of an interesting thing. And so it's kind of lists the top 10 counties that may be my ancestry. But again, it's all over the map. And my mom has, a lot of Irish heritage on both her maternal and paternal line. So I don't know which is from which side. So again, I just kind of file this away. And then I kind of looked at my DNA versus my mom's DNA. And I'm about half Irish. My mom is largely Irish with a little bit of Scottish. And these numbers change, of course, as they do each update for ancestry. But by and large, it's showing that there's some Cork connections here, Ulster and Munster provinces. And so again, I'm kind of just keeping this all as potential clues, anecdotal at best. But there's 3 DNA matches of interest that I thought were worth exploring. There was one that shared 91 centimorgans, and this person thankfully was responsive to my outreach and had a pretty robust public tree with a lot of documentation. So I thought this person did some very good research. DNA match number 2 had 60 shared centimorgans. This person would never respond to any of my outreaches. And this person had a Cahill surname. So it was very frustrating. But I did find match number 1 was able to tell me how that person, match number 2, fit into the family. She knew the connection. And then match number 3 had 42 shared centimorgans, and this person thankfully was also responsive and had a public tree. So I was able to review the work that they had done and make sure that they had credible information in their trees. And I did feel that they had very good research. And what I found was that all 3 matches were descendants of a Henry Cahill, who was born in 1867 in County Longford. And they each of these matches had come through a different child of Henry. So I developed a theory that that Henry was probably a brother to John Joseph Cahill, because if Henry was born about 1867, and I believe that John was born somewhere between 1860 and 1867 based on US records, they're close in age. And so on the left, I have my family, and my maiden name is Ross. So it's Kerri Ross, myself, to my mom, Kathleen Cahill, to my grandfather, Francis Cahill, to my great-grandfather, John Joseph Cahill. And then I show you where those matches fit in. And when I put those matches into DNA Painter, which is a free tool, they have a centimorgan project where you can put in the amount of shared DNA and see if this relationship is possible. It did tell me that I had a 30% probability of being a third cousin to match number 1, a 13% probability of being a second cousin once removed to match number 2, and 11% of being a third cousin to match number 3. So of course, I'd love for these probabilities to be a little bit higher, but the reality is it's telling me that these are absolutely possible relationships. If there was no probability, it would mean that this diagram that I set up wouldn't even be an option. So this is telling me this is absolutely possible. I then used another tool in DNA Painter called What Are the Odds? And this is a really neat tool and it's free. So basically, I put myself in and my birth year, and they want the years because they're kind of making some assumptions about generations. And what I did was I put in Henry Cahill, who I knew was born in 1867, and then I put his three children that were the ones that ultimately led to the matches. It's important to show where those matches fit and the number of centimorgans. And if you have any birth information, that's also very helpful. So then what I did was I hit suggest hypotheses. And what it's going to do is suggest where I might fit in based on the amount of shared centimorgans and the relationships that these people have. And when I clicked on that, it brought me to this pie chart of sorts. But basically what it does is it provides hypotheses. And so those are in the blue boxes. And you'll see there's 19 hypotheses in total. And then they have these scores, and the higher the score, the more confidence they have that that would probably be the more likely hypothesis. But you'll see a lot of them, they have me as a descendant of Henry Cahill, and I am not a descendant of Henry Cahill. I know I'm not. So I can actually take all those out. And then it leaves me with me being a descendant of an unknown sibling of Henry. And when I look at all that, I know that some of those later ones don't make sense. That's way too far. But I know my relationship to John Joseph Cahill. So when I put that in, I know that hypothesis 15 makes the most sense. Now, their score for hypothesis 16, which was the next one over with the blue X, that one was a higher score because my mom and her father have a 43-year age difference. My mom's the youngest of 7 children. And so they probably expected another generation to be in there, and that's why they gave a higher score to one generation later. So you're going to have to apply logic and your known information. But what this is telling me is that my theory is very likely that my great-grandfather was a sibling of Henry Cahill, and this is where I fit in. So this is a really good starting point, but I can't just base it on this. I have to go back to records. So I'm going to now go back to records based on what I know here. And I want to research Henry Cahill as the potential sibling of John. And I found his death certificate. He ultimately came and settled in Bronx, New York, and he had died in 1939. And it says that he was the son of Thomas Cahill and Bridget Kelly. And if you remember, Thomas Cahill was the name that was on John Cahill's death certificate. So this is making me feel better that there is a definite possibility that this is the right family. I then found Henry's civil birth record, and that further validated the parents' names as Thomas Cahill and Bridget Kelly. And it said that he was born in 1867 in Lislia in County Longford. So now I have a townland. I continued to do research, and I found another sibling of, I should say, or another child of Thomas and Bridget named Patrick Cahill. And he was born December 1st of 1864 in Lislia. The reason why I bring up Patrick is that 1864 then would not be the birth year for John Joseph Cahill, and probably not 1865 unless they had, his mom conceived right away. So it kind of put this other person during the time period that U.S. records sort of suggested that he was born. And when I continued looking, I found the baptism record for John Cahill. And he was indeed the son of Thomas Cahill and Bridget Kelly. He was born in Lislia, and he was baptized in July of 1862. So that's a little bit earlier, but it fell in that range of the 1860 to 1867 that I had discovered through U.S. records. So since then, I actually found another match that connected, because you just never know when new DNA matches will come up. And this was connected to the Kelly line. So this was through Bridget Kelly, the John's mother. And this new match was listed as FJ on Ancestry, sharing 91 centimorgans with me and 221 centimorgans with my mother. So of course that caught my eye. So there was somebody who was managing the account, and it turned out that she was the granddaughter of FJ. FJ has since passed away. And this person was able to tell me that FJ's paternal grandmother was Ellen Kelly, who was born in 1839 in County Longford. And I looked at all the records and everything supported this. So Ellen Kelly, I believe, was the sibling of Bridget Kelly, my second great grandmother. And my second great grandmother was born about 1841. So the sisters would have been just a couple of years apart. And this just kind of helped because now I had not only the Cahill DNA matches, but now I have the Kelly, which, so it brings the family together. So it's just giving me further validation. And the more matches that come up over time, the more I'm going to further validate all this. But I feel really good because everything is working together, the records and the DNA. And the amount of DNA fits the relationship. This person would have been a second cousin twice removed to me and a second cousin once removed to my mother. On that DNA painter, they have a tool, on the shared centimorgan, they have a tool where you can put in two amounts of DNA, or centimorgans, I should say. And so I put in the 91 and the 221, and it came up with all the possible relationships. And you can see here that the second cousin once removed and second cousin twice removed came up. And basically there was a 32% probability that I was that relationship and a 38% that my mother was the second cousin once removed. So this again further validates that this is absolutely a possible relationship based on the family diagram that we created. So the strategies I used in this case study were definitely starting with those family records and family stories. I had the family story as the starting point. That was critical. And then once I layered in some of those family records, things started to really open up. I gathered all those US records, looked at those baptismal records. I looked at civil records, censuses, and I kept going from there. I pulled everything out of those that I could. I looked at the fan club. In this case, it was the family members. And in this particular case study, DNA technology was really critical. I had to analyze that and I had to combine it with other records. So that was really really exciting for me to finally have a location where I can then now continue with my research. And I do hope to do heritage travel this summer. The next case study is Anna Daly, which was John Joseph Cahill's wife, my maternal great-grandmother. And she has a very different story, and I had to take a completely different approach to figure out where her family was from. So again, I'm going to start with those family records and stories. From all the stuff that I had collected on John Joseph Cahill, a lot of those applied to Anna. And so I know that Anna was born in Ireland in December of 1861, and this was based on the 1900 census that provided that information. She lived in upstate New York, and she had married Milo Hatch, who had died. And then she married John Joseph Cahill, my great-grandfather, on January 1st, 1894 in Watervliet, New York. And this was based on that marriage record, that 1930 record that I showed you earlier. They had 4 children in total, and 2 died very young. And she is buried at Holy Cross Cemetery in Brooklyn. My mom and I took a trip to the cemetery, and sadly there was no marker. In fact, there was markers all around them, but their plot had no marker. But I was able to speak to somebody at the office, and they verified that John and Anna and their 2 young sons were all buried together there. So I inherited this family plaque from my Uncle Frank, who was our family historian. He loved to do calligraphy, and he had created this. This is part of a larger plaque on grandparents. And he had this picture. This is Anna Cahill, but he listed her as Honora Hatch Cahill, 1860 to 1934. And I thought it was so interesting that she was called Honora here because every record that I ever found about her in US records, she was always listed as either Anna or Annie. And so I just thought that was really interesting. I kind of, was curious why this was. And sadly, my uncle had died, and I couldn't ask him anymore, like, where did you get the name Honora? And I tried in his later years, but he was in his 90s, and he cognitively, he really wasn't there. So by the time I started getting into genealogy, he was really, not able to communicate as well. And so this was a little bit of a mystery where Honora came from because, she never used that name in the United States. So I searched all US records as my next step, and I was unable to find a civil marriage record for Milo Hatch and Anna Daly. I only really know about Milo through family stories, so I wanted to get some documentation to support that. I believe I should be able to find a church record, and something that's still on my to-do list because I have to kind of go through a lot of churches. I'm not even sure exactly what denomination. Milo may have been Protestant, so I just need to check all the Roman Catholic churches and then kind of consider Protestant. But as far as Milo, I did do some research on him, and I found out that he was born in 1856 upstate, and he lived in West Troy. And you'll hear West Troy and Watervliet. Those towns are basically interchangeable names, and you'll see those on different records, but it's ultimately the same location. So he had lived in and worked in West Troy, and he died in 1892 at age 35. He's buried at a cemetery upstate, and the burial card indicated that the lot was owned by Mrs. Anna Hatch. So at least her name was Anna. I'm thinking, okay, this feels like it could be the right person. I looked at the 1892 New York State Census for Watervliet, and I found Milo and Annie Hatch living there. It said that Annie was born in the US, but I know she was born in Ireland, so I knew that was a mistake. But it also indicated her age, which suggested that she was born about 1859. I had her death certificate, and she had died in 1934 in Queens. It indicated that her birth date was December 15th of 1861. So this is very consistent with the December 1861 date that was in the 1900 census. But most importantly, it said that her father was John Daly of Ireland and her mother was Mary Ann Hogan of Ireland. In this case, the informant was her daughter, Anna, her married name was Voltman. So this is the same Anna that went to deliver the meal at the railroad to John Joseph Cahill. So Anna and her mother were very close, and her mother lived with her in her later years. So my hope is that this information is credible because they were very close, and this is her daughter, and so hopefully she knew the names of her grandparents. So my initial approach was to look at all later censuses for Anna to learn as much as I could about her. So I looked at the 1910, 1920, and 1930 censuses, and they were very consistent. She aged as expected. Her immigration years did not vary all that much. It was between 1861 and 1865. She had apparently naturalized, and it said she was 20 at the time of her first marriage, which may be a good clue for when I look for a record with Milo. I just don't know her exact birth year. But these censuses pretty much suggest that she was born about 1861 or 1862. So I'm feeling pretty good about that December 1861 birth date. I started to search for earlier censuses from 1860 to 1880, looking for an Anna Daly that lived with a father named John and a mother named Mary, or maybe Mary Ann, in New York. And I was focused more on upstate counties, but I kind of opened it up to all of New York. And unfortunately, I really couldn't find any viable candidates. The names John and Mary are very common, so that added an extra layer of difficulty. But those that had a daughter named Anna, the birth years really did not align. So I didn't find anybody that I really felt fit the bill. So I went back and I remembered that marriage record that I had showed you earlier from John's case study. And I remembered the witnesses were listed as Joseph Rowell and Susan Rowell. And I remember thinking, I've seen those names before. So I went back and I looked at my records and I realized that those names came up in the 1892 New York State Census. And you'll see that Milo and Annie are listed right here, but above them are Joseph and Susan and their two inferred children. And then below are Richard and Jeanette, they're in their 60s, and then other older children. So I hypothesize that these are the parents of Joseph. But these are the names for sure. So these were neighbors. They wound up being witnesses to her second marriage, but they are neighbors when she was married to Milo. I wanted to research them more. They're a part of her fan club. And so I needed to learn more about Joseph and Susan. Now, of course, the 1890 federal census was largely destroyed, so I couldn't turn to that. So I wound up going to the 1880 census. And at that time, I found Joseph and Susan living with their son, who was just an infant at that point, in West Troy. And so I'm going to pull this up a little bit bigger so that you can see it. So here they are in the red box, okay? And then if I scroll down, I see Richard Rowell and the family. And I'm thinking this has to correspond to those other family members that I saw. And I always like to look above and below the page before, the page after, and just look at the surnames to see if there's any potential family members. When I scrolled up a little bit, you'll see that there is a Dennis Daly with a wife named Mary Ann, and they have a bunch of children, one of which is named Annie. And so I'm going to kind of zero in on this for you now. So really struck me because they lived very close by. And now Dennis is not the right name. We know from the death certificate that John was the name of the father, but Mary Ann is the same name. So I'm feeling better about that. And Annie would have been born about 1859 based on her age in this particular thing. That's not, that's pretty close to the 1861 date that I was kind of looking at for her birth. But with that father's first name being different, I wasn't sure what to make of it. The mother's first name is the same, so I'm feeling a little bit better. And it suggests that they immigrated between 1865 and 1868 based on the birth locations of their children. You'll see if you look over to the right that their two youngest children were born in New York, but the rest of them were all born in Ireland, Mary, Annie, and Margaret. So this to me was really interesting. I found the family in the 1875 New York State Census, and they were even bigger. There were more children. Couple of them, there was a son named John also, and younger children here. So it's interesting to me how big this family is, and it's consistent. It's definitely the right family because Dennis was a gardener in 1880. He's listed as a florist in 1875. I did try to find the family in 1870, and for some reason I could not find them despite all of my attempts. So I'm not sure what that's about. But I then decided I would start to look at other records, particularly for the parents. And I found this poorhouse record for a Dennis Daly. And this was actually recorded in Rensselaer County, but that's the neighboring county. And it's just over the river. Troy is in Rensselaer County, and then right across the river is West Troy or Watervliet. So I knew this was possible from a geographical standpoint. And some of the information in this fit him. And what really stood out to me was that it said that he was from County Cork, specifically Queenstown. And that was my best clue yet. So I decided I needed to look a little bit more into that. And so don't forget, remember earlier I shared with you that County Cork had come up quite a bit in some of my DNA. And so, again, it was anecdotal at best, but maybe there's something here. Maybe this is another indicator. So County Cork is located all the way south in Munster province, and it was a popular place. Queenstown was where a lot of ships had, departed to come to the United States. So you'll probably see Queenstown on a lot of different passenger manifests. But I wanted to look into County Cork, and I did find their Irish marriage record. I have Dennis Daly marrying Mary Ann Hogan. They married on May 6, 1855 in a town called Cahill in County Cork. And if you remember, Mary Ann Hogan was the name that was listed on Anna's, as the mother of Anna on her death certificate in 1934. So I think this is my person. I'm like, okay, this is not, Mary Ann Hogan is not the most common Irish name. So I felt this had to be. So I started to look at baptismal records, and I looked for the oldest child, Mary, who was listed, of course, as Maria because of Latin in the baptismal records. And it said that she was baptized in 1856 and lists her parents accordingly as Dennis and Mary Ann. And then I found who I believe is my great-grandmother, who was listed as Honora Daly, baptized in 1857 to the same parents. And that's where I believe the name Honora, I think this was her original name. And Anna is absolutely a name that can be a derivative of Honora. I think Nora is probably a little more popular, but there's definitely resources out there that say that Anna or Hannah. Those are all variations of Honora. So what threw me off initially was that it says that she was baptized in 1857. That's a lot earlier than a lot of the U.S. records had indicated in the 1861. But again, those very fluid birth dates come into play with the Irish. I also found another child, James. I believe this corresponds to John, who was listed in the 1875 New York census. And there was also Margaret, who was baptized in 1865. And so those were the 4 children that were born in Ireland. So the strategies that I used for this case study were, again, starting with those family records and family stories and prior research. I gathered all those U.S. records for the research subject and their family members. I pulled everything out of them that I could. I looked at that fan club. And in this case, the marriage witnesses were also the neighbors, and that was amazing. For one, marriage witnesses for the second marriage were the same as the neighbors for the first marriage, and that was the only way I was going to solve this. So this is a perfect example where that fan club is instrumental and sometimes the only way to sort of crack open a case. So I want to just leave you with this quote from John Grenham. What you uncover about your family history depends on the quality of the surviving records for the area of origin, on the point from which you start, and the most important ingredient of Irish research, luck. So I do wish you luck in your endeavors. Irish research is not for the faint of heart. It takes a lot of time and discipline and dedication, but it's so gratifying once you do discover that place of origin, and it kind of opens up a whole other world of more research for you. So thank you so much for your time and attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. I'm going to stop sharing at this point.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. And as several people have noted, great case studies. Those were wonderful. I know those were personal, but they were so much fun to watch them just piece together. So thank you so much for sharing that.
My pleasure.
All right, we do have questions, so let's get started.
Okay.
So someone has a very specific topic, but they are wondering if there's any record of brewing associations or apprenticeships in Ireland in the 1750s. So they're looking for occupational history. Any suggestions?
That's the tough one. That time period can be really tough. It's such a very specific question and for a very early time period, because, it's difficult with Irish records, sometimes getting earlier than the 1800s. I often turn to newspapers, the Irish newspapers. Find My Past has a lot of Irish papers, but sometimes I'll search for some of those things in those type of records, and even other types of like just see if there's any types of books out there or anything that might have referenced those. But those are not necessarily what you're going to find in traditional records. Like, when you're looking for censuses or vital records, like you got to be a little more creative when you're talking about those types of organizations. I have personally not worked on that, so I can't speak from experience, but I'm thinking about what I would do if I was trying to find information on that. Those are kind of starting points. And I would also throw a question like that out. There's a lot of those I don't know if you're on Facebook, but a lot of these groups where you just don't know who may have experience in that area because it's such a niche question. So sometimes I just like to throw those questions out in an Irish genealogy group, a Facebook group, and see if anybody has any experience in that way.
Great response. Perfect. Thank you. All right, so I'm gonna combine a couple of questions. It's kind of interesting. People are trying to figure out where you found the church records. How were you able to obtain those baptismal records in Brooklyn? How did you know it was that church? And then how do you go about finding Catholic church records?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's tricky in New York. Brooklyn has their own archdiocese. It's separate from Manhattan. So if your family's from Brooklyn, the way I had to do it was I had to know their address. That's where addresses is one of the key strategies I use. That's why I love city directories and censuses, because addresses can be so helpful. You look at a map then, and you have to look at a more historical map and see what churches existed at that time, and or look in a city directory and see what churches were there. But you're basically looking at a map and seeing where they lived and what church they most likely attended. So it can get a little tricky. In this case, I knew their address was at 50th Street, and I could see the closest church was St. Michael's. And so, but there were other churches that were within distance that was, walkable. So I started with St. Michael's, and I just happened to hit the jackpot, and they were great. They actually had a whole automated approach where you could request the records, and I got them. So church to church, it varies, but you do have to do a little bit of due diligence in terms of understanding where they lived and then what churches may have existed. The only other problem is some of those churches have closed, and then their records have been kind of assumed by other churches. So Brooklyn can be a little tricky, but the Archdiocese of Brooklyn is helpful, and they can direct you on what churches, may have. They have different tools on their website as well about what years they were founded, that type of thing. For Manhattan, they have transcripts of the baptismal records for Manhattan and the Bronx on Find My Past. So you can actually do searches on there, and you'll at least have a transcript, and then you'll know what church you would reach out to request the original record. So that kind of is how I approach it as far as New York specific baptismal records.
Perfect. And then for any other state, it's pretty much the same, right?
I would think I specialize in New York, and New York can be kind of tricky, but I do that. Like recently, for a client with a Pennsylvania, I had looked at their address, and then I looked to see what churches existed in the area when they were founded, to see did they exist back then, and then I start reaching out to them. So you may have to reach out to a number of churches and to figure it out, but usually that approach of just the address and then figuring out what. And honestly, for Catholic, there was probably one or two churches in the area at that point. So chances are you'll find it there in that case. But it can it takes a little bit of legwork. It definitely does. Nothing, as I said, it's not for the faint of heart.
No, no. And especially with Catholic records, they're typically not digitized.
No, in fact, the on Find My Past, they used to have the original records. There was a relationship there for a while, and then they removed them. And now you can only get the transcripts, which is helpful, but it's unfortunate that they pulled them. So they're getting a little bit more precious about them. So
Fair enough. Someone's wondering, how did you make your chart? What did you use?
I just did that in Excel. Or actually, no, that one I probably just did in Word, because Word has a table feature. So sometimes I use Excel, but a lot of times I'll just build it right in Word. I'll do add a table, and you can say the number of columns and rows and kind of customize it as you like. So if you have a software program like that, it probably has that functionality.
Thank you. Can you repeat the Jewish Gen site that you mentioned? There was some Jewish Gen. I think it was just Jewish Gen.
I mentioned Jewish Gen?
It said, can you repeat? So
I didn't think I mentioned Jewish Gen in this presentation. I did the DNA painter I talked about. It was Irish. It's all Irish genealogy. I didn't talk. I do Jewish genealogy for other clients, but I did not mention Jewish Gen in this particular presentation. So I'm not sure. I had mentioned irishgenealogy.ie, which is the civil records from 1864 and forward. And then I mentioned rootsireland.ie, which is the subscription-based site.
okay,
And
perfect.
then townlands.ie was the other tool I had used to find like the jurisdictional information. So, but Jewish Gen, I'm familiar with Jewish Gen, but I don't believe I mentioned that in this.
Fair enough. I was going to say, I did a quick Google, and they do have Jewish communities and congregations in Ireland, which you already know of. So
That doesn't really come up very often, honestly, for me. Like I've done New York Jewish research, but usually it doesn't go back to Ireland. So
fair.
where where the family is, the place of origin.
Okay, so we're limited on time, so I'm gonna go to a last question. Someone's wondering if you can say anything more regarding poorhouse records.
Well, if you have Ancestry subscription or can use a library edition at at one of the public libraries like Allen County, um, they have the almshouse records there that you can do searches. So that's a great resource. You just never know if somebody wound up in an almshouse, so it's worth just doing a search to see if their name comes up. Just sometimes
Perfect.
people are down on their luck, and they may have been. I've seen it where people are financially comfortable for most of their life, and then in their later years they wind up in a situation like that. So
Well, thank you. So we're going to go ahead and end the questions there due to time constrictions. So we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. If you guys have additional questions, please feel free to reach out. And then you also have Kerri's contact information. So not only is she an amazing presenter, she also has her own company. So please reach out. You have her contact information, but please also reach out to us if you have questions that we can assist you with. We want you to be successful with your research, no matter what you're researching, where you're from, and we want to make sure that you are able to find what you're looking for. Oh, Kerri, I'm going to go ahead and send that to everybody. Uh, family dot.
yeah, I just put my email address at least in my in the chat just in
Okay,
case.
so it's Kerri at family.connector.com.
Yes, a mouthful. But
Perfect.
yes, I just put that there. So if anybody has a question that you'd like to reach out directly, I'm happy to answer you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Kerri has graciously allowed us to put this on our YouTube page for 30 days along with the handout. So please, if you need to review, check that out. And then after 30 days, we will be taking it down. So fair warning, you have a few times to look it over, a few days, but hopefully everybody is able to take a look at it in that time period. And we are so thankful to Kerri for this wonderful presentation. And thank you so much.
Pleasure.
I learned a lot. I'm sure everybody else did too. There's lots of wonderful comments in the chat. So thank you for that. And thank you, everyone. We appreciate
Well,
you being
thank you
here.
so much for your attention and have a great night, everybody.
Bye, everybody.